everyone. As Rhonda said, my name is Caroline Altman-Smith. I'm the Deputy Director of Education at the Kresge Foundation, which is based in Troy. We are delighted to be able to partner with the Michigan Community College Association in a number of ways through support for the center and for a number of different completion-focused initiatives happening in the state, like Project Win-Win, Credit When It's Due, the Guided Pathways work, the Consortium for Michigan Veterans Educators. It's just been really exciting from our vantage point to see, I think, the acceleration of momentum in Michigan in the community college space around student success-focused initiatives. So we're really delighted to get to work with a number of you all in this room in different ways. Kresge, as you may know, is a private national foundation. We're based, as I mentioned, in Troy, with a mission overall about expanding opportunity for low-income people in America's cities. So we have a real urban focus in our work. And within our post-secondary education work, we focus on helping more low-income and students of color successfully get into and through college, which is what brings us here today. So for today's session, some of the original ideas behind this work, I'm sure our presenters will talk about, but from Kresge's vantage point, the reason that we decided to fund this particular study, which you're going to hear more about last year, was because we're very interested in the notion of how transfer could work better, especially in urban markets, which are deemed quote-unquote thick. So in an urban market like Detroit, which Macomb Community College is in that metropolitan area, you have lots of different potential transfer options for community colleges. It's a very crowded landscape. As we know, it's hard enough to make transfer work smoothly, even when there are clear pathways, let alone when there are lots of community colleges, lots of four-year potential transfer destinations, and as we all know, many ways for students to get mixed up and lost and derailed along the way. There are a number of markets that are quote-unquote thin markets. If you think about places like El Paso or Phoenix, where there's really just one big community college and one big four-year college, in those kind of markets, it's a lot easier to make connections, to have really tight pathways and partnerships, because in El Paso's case, there aren't any colleges for like 500 miles in any other direction. So it's pretty clear who you need to partner with and what that needs to look like. In a place like Detroit, that is a lot messier, which is good for student choice, but there are also some downsides to that as well. So this transfer study, we've been hoping would really get at a number of questions, using Macomb sort of as the locus of study, and then partnering with the Community College Research Center at Columbia University, a teacher's college in New York, which, as we know, is one of the nation's premier national research shops on community college issues. So the study is hoping to get at a number of questions like, to what extent can transfer success, such as earning a bachelor's degree or not earning excess credits, be predicted from transfer type, demographic information, and enrollment patterns prior to arrival at the destination college? So helping us to explore today what they have learned through this study is Donna Petrus from Macomb Community College. Donna has served as the Dean of University Relations at Macomb for the past 6 years, and for 13 years before that, she was the Director of Marketing. So she's been at Macomb for almost 2 decades. She's the project lead on this transfer study and has earned degrees from Michigan State and from Oakland University. And then our guest today, coming in from out of state, is Michael Armijo. He is the Senior Research Associate at CCRC. He researches ways to improve student outcomes, focusing on transfer, competency-based education, and student support services. He evaluates program impacts and has experience analyzing the predictors of college completion using nationally representative longitudinal data sets. He has a PhD in education from the University of Pennsylvania. So please help me welcome these two folks to get our session started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Caroline, for kind of developing that context in terms of how the study, the genesis of that study and how it got started. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the overview and background of the study and kind of how we got started in this endeavor, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who is our data expert. So in terms of some background, I want to talk about a group that we started at Macomb called the University Partners Advisory Council. One of the initiatives was to try to further develop the relationships that we had with our four-year partners, and there's many of them. And so to do that, it was difficult because we would have interactions here or there, and it was difficult to kind of maintain that momentum. So the intent of the UPAC was to bring together these partners on the university side to dialogue and get to know each other better, and then further advance kind of what we do together. Collaboration, relationships are what really make things work. It's not just policy, it's not just a project like a research, it's really person to person. So in terms of the research design, one of the things that we talked about at the UPAC, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a minute, we started talking about general things, policy at the federal level, impacts in terms of student services. But what we found is many of our conversations seem to kind of focus and center around transfer. It's important to Macomb to make sure our students are successful once they leave, but it's also important from the four-year institution to have students coming in that are prepared. It's also important for some in terms of enrollment. So we really tried to dialogue more about the transfer specifically, which kind of led to, we really don't know enough about what happens. We have some information through the National Student Clearinghouse. We know where students go, but how many of them transfer and still continue their Pell Grants? What are their ages? Does the major at Macomb match the major at the destination? How many excess credits are they taking along with them that they've had to pay for, or not waste time, but certainly lengthen the time to completion? So all of those factors were questions that we were asking, but we didn't really have access to. And that, again, is what led to this, maybe we should study it more, see if we can get some more data, and then help with the predictive component to say what could we or should we be doing on either side to then help prepare those students and successfully complete and get the bachelor's degree. I'm going to let Michael go into the specifics about the research design. Caroline already mentioned the thick market idea. We also know that there are some state systems that have centralized reporting. It's a requirement through their legislatures and their state board of educations. As all of you in the audience know, Michigan is not one of those. We're very decentralized, so there really isn't a source to go to for that information. But what I've also found in conversations with others across the country that are in centralized markets or within states, they may have this information, they may have to report it, but it's really difficult to get back. They don't know to what level, if a student took a gateway course and got a GPA of X and then they transfer, how did they do in the next course at that university? Were they as successful? What was their GPA? So it really kind of peels away all of that kind of muddiness to get to the detail. So what led to the project was these conversations with the UPAC. We started with a pre-proposal to Kresge to talk about, here's an idea that we have, is this something that you would be interested in funding? It was positive feedback from there, and so we developed the full proposal. Data elements were determined with the UPAC input, so that's how we got to this point. I will tell you, I was sharing with Michael this morning, sometimes when you do these presentations or you listen to them, it all seems so linear and simple. Oh, they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and it was great, and it was seamless, and it didn't take much time. Well, that, as you know, isn't always the case. Some of the challenges that we had, even apart from just saying, give us your data, we had to develop 14 not different contracts. We tried to develop one contract with 14 institutions. As you can imagine, it went through everyone's legal counsel who had different input and ideas as to what should be in that contract. We really tried hard to keep it a generic contract, and in most cases we were successful. I think we have one or two outliers from the contract perspective. But we also ended up with 3 different contracts per institution. One was with the institution in Macomb because we were exchanging student level data. The second one was with the institution and CCRC because ultimately that data was going to be, it was de-identified, but ultimately CCRC was going to be handling that data. And then the third one was the reimbursement component in terms of the grant itself, in terms of the time and effort for those institutions to create the data. So it took a long time just to get through that part of it. And then you were working with various IR departments, some very sophisticated, some not so sophisticated in terms of trying to do the queries, to extract the information. That data came from the institution to Macomb. We tried our best to match at the student level, which Michael will talk about as well in terms of how successful we were with that, so that we could get that full picture. That full data set was then sent to CCRC for analysis. What you're going to be seeing as far as the different research questions, each of those are going to be addressed. there's going to be a lot of data. I'm going to caution you that please don't glass over in terms of the charts and the data and the statistics, because Michael's done a great job kind of pulling that together in context so that you have some key takeaways in terms of what all that data means. Let's see, I think I've covered everything. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michael to talk a little bit about CCRC.
Great. So I'd like to say thank you to Donna for her amazing job wrangling and herding all these cats to get these data agreements signed, get the data to us. So it's been wonderful to work with you. I appreciate it. A little bit about the Community College Research Center. So if you don't know us, we've been around for about 20 years. It's our 20th anniversary. And we're basically an independent authority that looks at and does research around community colleges across the nation. So some topics that we study, of course, are like the high school to college transition. Once you get to college, if you're in developmental education, we do a number of research projects around reforming developmental education and helping those students get out and into credit-bearing courses. Then, of course, we're also concerned with persistence, completion, and transfer. Some projects I work on look at online education and the ability to basically take courses and learn on demand. And then finally, we do a lot of research around the transition from college into the workforce and how people, if people are able to do that successfully, and what are they earning when they're able to do that as well. So I'll let Donna say a little bit more about Macomb.
Macomb was described as in a thick market. We serve about 44,000 students annually. As noted here, we have a lot of transfer plans. We work with about 40 different institutions on those plans across the state. So Macomb in and of itself awards the highest number of associate's degrees in the state of Michigan. And then also I wanted to mention that 50% of our students intend to transfer, and you'll see some stats later that's a little bit higher than the national average. But again, because of the lack of data, those are what students tell us when they first come to Macomb, but we don't necessarily, prior to this, had a really good idea of how many actually do transfer, and is it a linear path for them, or do they swirl? So we'll go into that a little bit as well. Let's see. A little bit more about the UPAC. This slide represents the number of UPAC partners and who they are. It's important to note that some of it's the full spectrum of the institutional type. We have some that are obviously research-based, selective admission institutions, all the way down to some very small privates, which I think contributed to some insight as far as the data, because not all patterns are the same based on institution type, just like any other variable that we studied. One thing I wanted to mention as well is a key point for Kresge is to be able to, when they do fund projects, is the scalability. So one of our charges is to communicate this information to you and help you kind of picture how this would work in your market. Even if you're in a thin market, you may not have 14 institutions that you want to work with, but certainly developing that dialogue and creating a forum to then, if it's a one-to-one where you have, let's say you're Grand Rapids Community College, you want to work with Western, it's important then to make sure that you also can do this. Western is an example, has created the query already. So they've done all the data elements. Their IR staff has gone through the process of saying, okay, if a student transferred in from Macomb, here's all the data elements I need to pull on that student. If you want to replicate that with one of those institutions that are on the slide, all they really need to do is take out the institution as Macomb and insert your institution. So it's important to know that a lot of the hard work has been done, so there is an opportunity there to start working with your partners to look at this data. So let's get to the data.
Great. Thank you, Donna. Mm-hmm. Also, to follow up on Donna's point, even if you're in a thin market or you only have a few partners to work with, I think a lot of the metrics that we talk about today are still going to be valid metrics and things you might want to consider and look at. So that's also something that sort of spans the spectrum. So I'll tell you a little bit about our project motivation. Why are we studying transfer? And I think the primary reason is that transfer students are at greater risk of not graduating. The transfer in graduation rate in Michigan for students who begin at a college, how many of them finish? It's about 40% for transfer students. For native students who begin at a public four-year institution, the graduation rate's about 50%. So you're about 10 percentage points less likely to graduate if you're a transfer student. Donna mentioned, a number of the institutional practices and policies around transfer can be barriers, and you can imagine with 220 different transfer plans, there's a lot of administrative detail, and that can be a challenge for students to navigate. So we wanted to perhaps try to identify some places to look to help the institutions focus in on where can we improve the transfer pathway. The last piece of the motivation, I think, is part of the UPAC. The impetus for founding the UPAC was really to work together on some of these student success issues, and I think transfer is one of the major ones we've heard come up over and over again. So now I'll give you a little bit of the background around transfer generally in the state of Michigan. So we have in Michigan over 28 community colleges and over 400,000 students. Lots of students in Michigan transfer. It's about 160,000 students transferred at some point. And I think this data was from the National Student Clearinghouse in 2014. So about 37% of students transfer to a four-year university. This is above the national average. It's actually in the top 10 in the nation for the amount of students that community colleges are sending to four-year destinations. So that's awesome. And then transfers are critical to bachelor's degree production in the state. About 43% of all bachelor's degree completers actually enrolled in a two-year institution at some point over the last 10 years before they earn their bachelor's. So I think transfer is really crucial here, especially to students who get their BA. A little bit about transfer student outcomes in the state. About a quarter of students actually earn an associate degree prior to transferring. And the graduation rate for transfers who make it to a four-year institution, this is the number of people who transfer in that finished, divided by the total number of people who transferred in to the institution. It's about 40%. Private institutions do have to do some work graduating. Their transfer students' graduation there is about 14%, which is in the bottom 10 nationally, below the national average. Great, so what are some common barriers to transfer student success in particular? And I think one of the major ones is, financial resources. Basically, persistence isn't financially feasible. Over dinner last night, we were talking about a number of the challenges that students at Macomb face, and that can range from paying for books, paying for their transportation, I mean, you name it, even paying for homes. Quite frankly, there were some students who were struggling with homelessness. So financial resources, I think, is one of the number one reasons or barriers for transfer students. Next is academic preparation. If you think you want to get a four-year degree, but you start out in developmental ed, it's very difficult to get into those credit-bearing courses. So that's kind of the first hurdle. And the second hurdle is once you transfer from a four-year to a two-year, in the literature it's been documented there's a phenomenon known as transfer shock. And that's basically when you get to the four-year, the coursework's harder, things are different, and it tends to be that your first and second semester grades are actually lower. And so that can be a barrier, is just getting accustomed to the level of work. Next, the lack of information is obviously a barrier. Again, navigating some of these administrative pathways and knowing, what courses do I even need to take to transfer? What are they going to accept? A lot of students don't know that. Increases their excess credits, increases their time to degree. Another barrier can be the campus climate. And I think also, these are not only barriers, but they can be levers if you actually realize what's going on with your students and how to act on them. But one of the challenges sometimes is the climate on campus. And this is basically, how does the organization view transfer students? What's their attitude towards transfer students? Are they someone that we look out for and we support their success? Or are they just kind of hidden in the mix at the institution and no one's paying attention to transfers? And then finally, a well-documented barrier to student success in general is social integration. Do you feel at home when you get to campus? Or do you feel like that you can connect with your faculty and staff? Or are you integrated into the social life? And so when students transfer, this is a big change, right? There's going to be more work. There might be larger courses. There might be different relationships with the faculty. And so they might integrate socially differently into the four-year destination. Okay, so a little bit about our research design. Our goal for the study was really to understand the different types of transfer students based on their transfer patterns, what are their success rates, and then what are the factors that are related to their success and failure. And so to do that, we started out by descriptively, we're just going to look at their characteristics to try to get a sense of what's going on at Macomb and at the destinations. Next, we'll look at their enrollment patterns and try to see, maybe there's some things around how they spend their time at the 2-year, the 4-year, or the public or private institutions, the kind of majors they have, et cetera. And then finally, we'll use that information to inform what goes into our predictive models to try to give us some purchase, basically on what can tell us about how students will either transfer and how they'll finish their degrees. So our data comes from 3 different sources, and you've heard a little bit about it. First, we got the administrative data from Macomb Community College to identify the whole pool of people who could potentially transfer. Next, we combine that with the National Student Clearinghouse data. And for those of you who might not know what the NSC is, it's often referred to as the NSC. This is basically a clearinghouse that collects the degree and enrollment pattern information for students nationwide. So it's kind of like a census of people who are in college, and do they complete and are they enrolled. So from the clearinghouse, we can figure out, did you earn a degree? If you did, where did you earn a degree? And then what field did you earn a degree in? Also, because students are tracked every single term, we can use the clearinghouse data to figure out exactly what kind of transfer patterns did students have. Were they enrolled at Macomb for 3 terms, then they transferred to a destination for 2 terms, and then maybe they came back to Macomb for 1 or 2 terms. We can get that fine-grained with the clearinghouse data. One of the limitations, though, of the clearinghouse data is that we don't have information on students' credits or their grades. And so that's where the UPAC colleges come in. They sent us a lot of administrative information about their students, including the student-level unit records. So we have course-level grades for students that we used for the study, and we use that to calculate their credits accumulated, their GPAs, and then also what they studied when they got to the UPAC destination. Some limitations for the study. So we matched students with an encrypted ID, but about 40% of the students from the UPAC couldn't be matched to their Macomb records. So we're trying to explore that to see what might be the issue there. But just so you know, when we report on UPAC credits, we're only going to be reporting on basically a subsample. We did a little sensitivity testing to look, are the students who have UPAC records, are they very different from the students who don't? And we looked at their descriptive characteristics and compared them, and they're pretty similar to the students who have UPAC data. So it's not like the poor performers don't have data or something like that. They're looking very similar. So I think we're okay to proceed on that front. Some other things with 14 different schools, we got 14 different data sets. They do things 14 different ways often. So we had to come up with one way to calculate a GPA. And so what we'll be presenting today is our consistent way across schools to calculate the GPA. So we'll consider it an estimated GPA. Might be different from on your campus. The same for credit accumulation policies. Some schools might award credit for students who get a D. Some schools might not award credit for that. You might have to get a C or better. So we just took one standardized approach to calculate the credit accumulation. So again, an estimated credit accumulation. Also, I think almost every college now has what's called an academic renewal policy. This is for students, say you take calculus and you get a D. You want to get a better grade than that because you're a STEM major, so you can retake calculus, and if you get an A, then only that A grade will count towards your GPA. The D grade doesn't when you go through the academic renewal process. So I think this is very important for students to stay, basically off academic probation or help stay eligible for financial aid. And it's used in a variety of different ways, but we did not take into account academic renewal. So just to put that out there. In terms of the sample of students that we used for this study, we looked, to begin with, at first-time in college students. They had to have enrolled in Macomb between the spring of 2007 and the spring of 2009. We isolated the students that completed 9 or more credits because we wanted to, not include those people who are taking recreational courses or maybe the 4-year student who comes back home for a semester and takes 1 class, something like that. The students had to then have transferred between our transfer window, and our transfer window is the fall of 2007 to the spring of 2009. And we picked these years because then enough time will have elapsed by in order to observe their 6-year graduation rates in the NSC data. So spring of 2009 6 years would be 2015, and we got the data pulled from the NSC this year, so we were able to capture those students as late as 2015 graduates. And then also our sample, we wanted to focus in on the UPAC since that's the major partner, so you had to have gone to a UPAC institution. Here's how the numbers break out. We can see that between spring of 2007 and spring of 2009, about 56,000 people enrolled at Macomb. 47,000 had taken 9 or more credits during that time. Of the 47,000, about 5,700 students transferred between our transfer window. Not only that, about 4,500 students transferred to a 4-year institution. So about 80% of the transfers at Macomb are transferring to 4-year institutions. And then of those who transferred to a 4-year institution, 3,700 transferred to a UPAC institution. And so about 82% of the transfers to 4 years are going to UPAC. So they're by far and away the majority transfer destinations. And so our analytic sample consists of those 3,713 students. On to our first research question. Oh, and also if you have questions during the presentation or ask about a graph, I think we can take questions during the presentation as well. So I just want to put that out there. Research question number 1 is, what are the characteristics of transfer students? And so we want to look at their transfer patterns. You know, how many went directly to the 4-year, how many went to the 4-year and then returned back to campus, et cetera, et cetera. We also want to look at their demographics and their background. You know, what's their age? Are they men or women? Financial aid status, majors, things like that. Next, we'll look at their credit accumulation, both at Macomb, at the UPAC destination, and in total at both places. And then finally, we want to know, are transfer students actually finishing? What's the completion rate like for people who start at Macomb? A little bit about how we defined our transfer groups. And so we had 3 groups of transfer students, and I like to define them by using their actual enrollment patterns. Terms like direct transfer, reverse transfer, they've been used in many different ways. In fact, reverse transfer, I think, is a Macomb-specific term to refer to credits that get sent back to the institution. So because this has been differently defined in the literature, we wanted to stick with their patterns. And so 2-4 students start at Macomb, and they transfer to exactly 1 additional college, which is a UPAC college, because of the way we define the sample, and they stay there for at least 1 semester. So you can think of these as like traditional direct transfers. You go right to the 4-year college, and you stay there. The 2-4-2 transfer pattern is when students start at Macomb, they transfer to at least 1 UPAC college, but then the key point is that they return back to Macomb. So we might think of these as reverse transfer students, but the key point here, and what makes them different from swirlers, is that they start at Macomb, and then they come back to Macomb for their last semester. Then with swirlers start at Macomb, but then they might transfer to 2 or more colleges for at least 1 semester. So swirlers can go to multiple 4-year institutions, multiple 4- and 2-year institutions, but the point with these folks is they don't wind up coming back to Macomb after they attend a few destinations. So more broadly, why do we care about the transfer patterns? And I think there's a few different reasons. So in the literature, and our hypothesis is that students who directly transfer and have that 2-4 transfer pattern, they're the most likely to graduate, right? They're not spending time and money attending multiple institutions and having to get credits transferred around and accepted. So I think they're the most likely to graduate. They're most likely to be socially integrated into the campus since you're not attending multiple schools. Also, the 2-4-2 transfers and swirlers tend to spend more time and money than is necessary. Taking excess credits, oftentimes these folks have little return on their investment. They're not earning a 4-year degree. In a lot of cases, they may not even be earning an associate degree. So that can be a problem. So we want to pay attention to those. And then finally, by examining the student characteristics, we can see if the transfer patterns are more likely to occur among certain groups. And this might give us some insight into what are the levers that can improve student transfer. What are the student behaviors and the student decision points that we can intervene on to improve transfer outcomes? Yes?
Was there any pattern in terms of major or degree programs when you're looking at student characteristics versus did you see STEM were more successful, or was it more
That's a good question. So if, the question was if we saw any patterns in terms of student characteristics and their majors. And we actually didn't look at student characteristics by their majors. What we did was we looked at the students' I guess, propensity to complete a degree by their major for transfer students, and how often the transfer students' major at Macomb matched their major at the destination. But I think that's a good question because it probably is the case that some students are more concentrated, some groups of students are more concentrated in some majors than others. Yes, so over here, and then we'll come to the back.
When you're referring to your 242 transfer students, when you're collecting this data, is this coming from the clearinghouse? Are these students who are just reverse transferring credits back to graduate, but they're still staying enrolled in the four-year college, and they're persisting for the baccalaureate degree, or are they coming and actually enrolling in a two-year institution again?
Yes, so this is a good question. So are the 242 patterns of transfers real reverse transfers? Are they just sending their credits back? And as far as we can tell, well, so this is a good question, and this is one that we're looking into, and you'll see some of the numbers where we're not sure about this. So I think generally most of the reverse transfers are actually really returning to campus because it tells us their enrollment date and their enrollment location, but I think there may be some issues with the clearinghouse data because, as we'll see, the reverse transfer students are able, some of them are able to earn a bachelor's degree. So something that, this is a work in progress, something that we need to keep looking into. A great question.
I have a similar question then. Stuck a little bit on the comment you made during the last slide. You said the 242 students completed their last semester.
Yes.
Then, by definition, they probably aren't a bachelor degree completer because most universities have policies that your last semester must be completed in residence, right?
I'm not familiar, but that very well could be the case. So I think this is something that has come to our attention. I think we definitely need to look into it, but that's good. And then also there's issues with reporting to the clearinghouse. Not everyone uploads things at the same time. So if they report at different times or different dates are actually entered into the administrative database, this can make things look a little wonky. But very good points, and I appreciate the feedback. Yes, in the back.
Just a complication to that when a lot of four-year schools are allowing students to transfer final credits from community college to get that bachelor's, so that data is going to get really muddy.
Thank you. Yeah, so some of the complications with reverse transferring credits, not necessarily transferring people to campus. So thanks for pointing these issues out. Okay, so let's go on and see, well, how do the transfer students break down in terms of their transfer patterns? Here we can see about 80% of the students pursued that 2-4 transfer pattern. So about 80% are directly transferring. We have about 9% that have a 2-4-2 pattern or reverse transferring, about 13% swirled around multiple institutions. Looking at the age distribution of students, we thought, maybe older students are more likely to swirl or reverse transfer. And it looks like overall the three groups are pretty similar in age, and it looks like those 2-4-2 transfers, they might be slightly younger perhaps. Only about 20% of them are 21 to 30 years old. So descriptively it looks like maybe the reverse transfer students are younger. Looking by race, we can see that students of color are more likely to swirl around. So also, when we look at the gender distribution, we see that 2-4 transfers are slightly more likely to be female. So they're about 5-6 percentage points more likely to be female than the other groups. One thing to note about the slide, the missing students, some students had missing gender. They're not included on this slide, which is why they don't add up directly to 100%. Next, we looked at the transfer students, some indicators of their SES and their academic performance. And so here we can see the EFC and Pell recipients by type of transfer pattern. And we see that basically swirlers tend to have a lower EFC on average, and they're more likely to receive Pell grants, and they have a higher financial aid award amount. So they tend to be, looks like, at least more financially needy than those direct transfers on average. When we looked at students' high school graduation rates, their dual enrollment rates and their placement exam scores, it's basically similar across all three groups. So there aren't big differences in those metrics. Next, we took our transfer sample and we want to see, are some students starting in the spring or in the summertime? Maybe that is related to their transfer pattern. Turns out it doesn't appear so. About 60% of the students matriculate in the fall. The other 40% spread evenly between spring and summer. Also, we looked at when do the students matriculate? Maybe folks who've been on campus for longer have different transfer patterns. And generally, we can see, some students did linger around campus for 3 to 4 years before transferring, so those in 2003 and 2004. About 35% of the students spent 3 or more years on campus prior to transferring. And then about half the sample comes from the year or two before our transfer window, so they began about a year or two before transferring. And here we can see, the missing UPAC transcripts spread pretty evenly across the 3 different transfer types. So some key takeaways from this section are that the swirlers are more likely to be students of color. The 2-4 transfers and swirlers are more likely to be Pell recipients and have a lower EFC. The 3 types of transfer have similar academic performance, at least prior to arriving at Macomb. And then most transfers matriculate in the fall, like most students, and over 30% of the transfer population had been on campus for 3+ years. Great, so next we looked at the majors for transfer students. So what are they studying at Macomb? Here we can see that arts and humanities and English are by far and away the most popular major for transfer students. If we zoom in to the rest of the majors, then we can see, what else matters for students. And we see here, transfers tend to come from business and marketing, allied health, and education and childcare. About 200 students or slightly more tend to transfer from those fields. And the rest of the different majors, I guess these are fields. I would refer to them as fields because we take every major and then we aggregate it up into 22 larger fields. So students from the other fields are not as apt to transfer, I would say. And this gives us some purchase into the credit accumulation we see in the next slide, I think. Yes?
Was there any correlation with articulation agreements that Macomb has with UPAC schools in terms of perhaps that's an additional motivator for transferring?
That's a great question. So we did not look into the articulation agreements and transfer, but I think this would be pretty much a key variable for some of these predictive models. So I think this is something to consider. So yeah.
One of the barriers to that is what does the four-year institution do with the transfer plan? Macomb maintains our transfer plans on our student system. So when a student declares a program, we can actually see that they intend to transfer to this institution in this agreement that we have. But on the other side of that, not every four-year institution captures whether or not a student was following that transfer plan. So it's difficult because it's not the same on both sides. So your question's a great one. There are a couple of institutions that do track students that come in using a transfer plan, but not all of them do. Go ahead.
Well, let me make, just as a follow-up.
Sure.
Students originating from Macomb, you understand what their program of intent, their major is. Whether they're 2+4, 2-4-2, or swirler, there's really no way to check at other institutions what curriculum they're continuing to follow. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I'm suggesting because we have been able to match major or program of study, or because Michael took zip codes and combined them into these areas. But what we don't know is if the student was specifically following a plan.
I see.
Once they get to the 4-year. One other caveat to that is the fact that at Macomb, students can have multiple programs, so it makes it even a little more muddy in terms of whether or not they might have a regular Macomb program as well as a transfer plan, but it's not clear as to whether or not which specifically one the student was following, even if they transfer.
Gotcha. And for all four, there's articulation agreements between all 14 UPAC schools
Yes.
and Macomb. Okay, great. So even as an institutional characteristic, it would be, they all have them. Okay.
Just final,
Sure.
continuation. So would you be able to analyzing the data in terms of home students that sign try to get a suggestion on whether or not that the factor of having that articulation program may lead to some of these increased numbers in particular majors.
Because Macomb does track specific transfer plans for the student, if they declare that on their student record, I think we could. We haven't yet, but I think we could.
Interesting. All right. So yeah, that would be great to know how, what percentage of students are on one of these transfer pathways.
And in addition to that, because there's other evidence out there that shows that when students follow a specific articulation agreement through a particular four-year institution, actually their performance and their retention and graduation rates go up. So that was something that struck me when I saw your data about transfer students having difficulty in transferring, but actually when they're following a specific articulation agreement to a specific place, they actually are doing better. So I don't know if you had looked at that.
So.
You're saying that you had not yet.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's a good question. So oftentimes in the data, it can be difficult to tell from administrative data if the student A, signed up for one of these plans, and B, actually did it. So I think that is a limitation, but something we can be aware of. And at least it seems like there's an indicator we can look at to see how many at least signed up for one of these plans on paper. But looking at their enrollment behavior matters a lot. And as a follow-up for this, so the way we calculated the students' field of study was actually from their enrollment behavior. So we looked at their course-taking patterns to calculate this. A lot of times we look at the students' intent, but that doesn't really match up with what they're doing in reality. So we actually looked at what are the courses that they took, what are the most frequent SIPs of those courses, and then the most frequent SIP code became their major by de facto since they're taking courses in that field. So this is how we calculated the field of study. Next, we wanted to see the credits earned by transfer type. And so we can see that, on average, the 2-4 transfers are clearly accumulating more credits at Macomb, at the UPAC institutions, and overall. Another thing to note is that on average, the 2-4 transfers are graduating with approximately 20 or more excess credits. And so this is a simple major, right? A simple measure of excess credit accumulation because we just cut the line off at 120. If students are in engineering or maybe in nursing, those obviously have higher credit thresholds. But we saw from the field data, at least, that a small percentage of students are in those fields. So we don't think there's a lot of nurses pushing up this number. We think this is probably what's actually happening. And then again at the UPAC, we see students accumulating potentially what could be about 20 excess credits. Great. This slide displays the percentage of students at Macomb and at the UPAC destinations that are earning more than 60 credits. So we see that at Macomb, about 40% of the direct transfers earn more than 60 credits prior to transferring, and about 30% of the swirlers and the 2-4 transfers. Once they get to the UPAC destination, 71% of direct transfers of the 2-4 pattern earning more than 60 credits at the UPAC. So this is a good question for these articulation agreements, I think. Even if we have the articulation agreement, it would be interesting to break this out by students who had an agreement, students that didn't, to see to what extent they actually matter for this kind of a metric. Yes?
And then also you're saying excess credits. Is that in reference to the articulation agreement and what those additional graduation requirements may be from the UPAC? Was it indeed extra or was it just above this number threshold?
That's a good question. So excess credits in this slide is defined by a simple threshold of more than 60, or in the case of the bottom, more than 120. So it doesn't get at those finer grain programs that might have a higher credit limit, for instance. But we saw from the field slide, those are relatively small. Transfer students are relatively underrepresented in those
And
fields.
also, with the excess credits that are home, is that looking at course placement and remediation, development, course sequencing that will be required prerequisites for the programs?
So this does not include the developmental ed courses. These are credit-bearing courses only.
One thing I want to point out, though, is when Michael uses the term excess, it may not be
Yes.
wasted in
Yes.
that sense, because many of the agreements that we have with the UPAC institutions are what I would term as 3+1s. So a student could earn more than the traditional 60 or 62 credits for an associate's degree that would apply to their degree for the bachelor's. Some of our 3+1s go as high as 90 credits that can be earned at Macomb. So that's an explanation too, in terms of, even though there might be excess credits based on these number thresholds, they may not be wasted credits.
So then what is the point, the purpose of the 60 credit threshold for this study?
I think in general at CCRC, when we look at students' credit accumulation, we tend to use kind of simple thresholds to say, most associate degrees require 60 credits. If you're getting more than 60 credits, then you're basically spending time and money potentially taking courses that don't count towards that, but it's not always the case, and that's why it's important to have this kind of context and these kind of conversations.
Federal policy is looking very closely at that excess credits in terms of transferability, so that from a financial aid perspective, students aren't taking classes, or the federal government isn't paying for classes that then don't apply to a major or a degree. So what we've tried to do here, though, is kind of look at that kind of at that top level. Keep in mind that you are all being afforded the first opportunity to see these data. Not all of the analyses are done yet. So we need to delve more and more down into the weeds to kind of look at that detail. And so those are going to be some of the next steps. So this is just kind of that first look of the overall data in terms of what we're finding.
Yes, and this is just a place to start, right? This is a conversation starter, I think, for the institution. Say, okay, a lot of people are earning excess credits, potentially excess credits. Let's dig down into the data and see if those are actually real excess credits or not, what's going on. And so I guess this is the way to start the conversation. This isn't the definitive statement. And one thing to mention also is this is happening at every college. This is not like a Macomb specific issue here. Across the board nationally, we see students, especially bachelor's degree completers, on average earn about 20 excess credits, or 20 credits above that 120 threshold. Yes?
When you were talking about looking at intent of the student at home versus the course enrollment pattern, and then kind of having a de facto major, were you able to see if there was any pattern or suggestion, inference, that perhaps students may have changed their intent from when they initially began in Macomb? I thought I was going to be an accountant, then after 3 semesters I became a nurse. Therefore, it looks as though I may have excess credits, but I really just had a shift in my career focus.
Yes, so we did not look at the switching between intent and their actual major, but I think that's a good thing to consider. And I think you're absolutely right that sometimes students change their mind, right? I'm not saying it's a negative reason why students are accumulating excess credits. I'm just saying this is what's happening. We need to figure out if that's the case. That might be completely okay. But it's a place to start asking questions just like that one. So thank you. All right, so for those students who actually come back to Macomb, those swirlers or reverse transfers, we wanted to also know, what do they do when they get back to Macomb? How many credits do they take? And here we can see that the 242 transfers, when they return back to Macomb, attempt on average about 12 more credits, and they wind up earning about 10 more credits than swirlers. So they tend to stay at Macomb longer than swirlers who might just be stopping in. Looking at the GPAs of students who transferred, before and after transfer, first of all, we can see that direct transfers tend to have higher GPAs than students who swirl or do the 242 pattern. Also, looking at their GPA pre-transfer and post-transfer, it looks like those swirlers and 242 transfers might be experiencing that transfer shock phenomena. They have slightly lower GPAs when they go to the destination institution. Next, we looked at their credential attainment by type of transfer. And here I think one of the great things and one of the great takeaways from this slide is that the vast majority of direct transfers that come from Macomb are graduating. Now, almost 75% of students who 2-4 transfer to a UPAC destination are actually completing a degree. This is far above the statewide average. The statewide average is like 40%. So you're 35 percentage points more likely to earn that degree. Even among swirlers are doing a relatively good job of earning a degree, about 43% of them. And then you see here with the 242 transfers, about 35% at least appeared on paper to earn a bachelor's degree or be part of this pattern. So we need to continue to investigate that. Another point is that very few students are earning an award prior to transferring. So we see very few get an associate or a credential, and that some students are actually earning the associate degree after they transfer, probably as a result of this reverse transfer credit policy. Yes?
I just wanted to point out the previous slide and this slide, how I think powerful they are, especially looking at the swirler population. I think sometimes there is an assumption that swirlers may have some academic difficulty, put on probation because of satisfactory academic progress and tail requirements and so forth, and are looking to sort of restart at different schools, for which your data is suggesting that no, that the GPAs are within a comparable range and at least passing above 2.0, and they're also eventually completing. So I just wanted to make sure that that was emphasized.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes?
You just said that very few students earn a degree or award before they transfer.
Yes.
I'd be curious if you have thought about teasing out the data of those UPAC schools, the ones that are part of the university center as opposed to the ones that are not.
Yes.
Because with Macomb having the university center on campus, it's a very easy thing for them to go to the university and Macomb at the same time, as opposed to having to physically go to a different site for a university. So you might find differences with the award between those two different sets.
Between the sites. Yes, that's a great question. And something.
Michael does have, in future slides here, an actual breakout by institution, so we might be able to get to some of that.
Yes, and I'm going to ask folks to hold their questions. I'll be happy to answer them at the end, but I do want to get through this because I'm really excited about it, and I want you all to see what's happening at the destinations. All right, so the key takeaways here are that 2-4 transfers have a better GPA than swirlers or the 2-4-2 transfers at Macomb and when they get to their UPAC destination. The vast majority of students accumulate at least some excess credits, some credits above that threshold, and I challenge you and the university working together with me to try to figure out, what is actually going on with that excess credit accumulation, and is it necessary or not? And then, of course, the 2-4 transfers complete at the highest rates, 74% of 2-4 transfers complete. Okay, great. So let's look at some of the enrollment patterns. And here we're going to look at the colleges they attended, their enrollment intensity, and of course their outcomes by the different destinations. And we'll also get some purchase on their major matching. So the time spent in public versus private institutions. So we can see here that the vast majority of students spend the most of their time in public institutions, but swirlers are more likely to spend some of their time in private institutions. So there's some association there potentially. Next, we wanted to see, well, are students spending more time in the 2-year sector than the 4-year sector? How does that break out? We can see that 2-4 transfers spend the least amount of time at Macomb, and those 2-4-2 transfers spend the most amount of time. Next, we looked at students' enrollment intensity. Are students taking time off? And so this basically calculates of all the potential terms a student could have enrolled, how many did they actually enroll? And so we see that before transfer, students are enrolling about 60% of the potential terms, which means they're stopping out at some point. They're taking a semester or a term off. After transfer, though, 2-4 transfers are enrolling in almost every single term that they can. And it looks like 2-4-2 transfers and swirlers might be stopping out at some point once they get to their destination, or they're more likely to stop out at least. So that's something to consider. And then, of course, we thought, well, maybe it has to do with starting as a full-time student. It looks like that's not the case. About 2/3 of the students at Macomb are actually part-time and then transferring. Great. Here we break out some results by each UPAC destination. So on the vertical axis, each letter corresponds to a particular UPAC destination, and we've sort of hidden their names for confidentiality purposes at this point, especially because we haven't even discussed all of this with them yet. And we can see here that by destination, only a low percentage of students actually earn an associate before transferring. So it's not like you need an associate or you want an associate before you transfer to a particular destination. And we also see that at some colleges, about 30% are actually earning an associate after they transfer, potentially to the reverse transfer policy or potentially because they're actually, maybe they're co-enrolled, we thought. Maybe they're attending 2 schools simultaneously. And when we look at the data, that's exactly what we see. The 242 transfers and the swirlers are much more likely to co-enroll. And co-enrollment is basically attending 2 schools simultaneously in the same term. We don't consider this a form of transfer because students often need to get some kind of administrative permission to do this from their primary institution and for those credits to actually count at the primary institution. So we think of it more as like a characteristic of transfer students, that they might do this phenomenon. Next, we looked at students in Macomb. What was their field of study at Macomb? What was their field of study when they got to the destination? And do they stay in the same field of study? The answer is about half of the students actually transfer in the same field of study. When we look at by destination, what's their mix of transfer type or the transfer pattern students are going through on campus? We can see there's a lot of variation when it comes to the transfer patterns. So first of all, we can notice that the majority of students at every destination tend to be 2-4 students, but that there are some institutions where being a swirler or being a reverse transfer is much more common than others. So I think, at least for the UPAC destinations, when we get into those conversations, this will be a good starter about what might be going on campus and ways to intervene.
Just one comment. Macomb has historically, especially during the time frame of the students, when we studied these students, had concurrent enrollment programs with 2 primary destinations. So it was encouraged that the students co-enroll. So that may explain some of it as well.
Great. Thank you, Donna. And again, these might be phenomenon of exactly what we're talking about here, but that's why we need to dig deeper and investigate. So we're not passing judgment on the schools. We're just putting a prompt out there as places to look into. Looking at the graduation rates across destination institutions, we can see there's a lot of variation. And again, this is the transfer in graduation rate. So this is basically the numerator is the number of students who finish, the denominator, the number of students who started, who transferred in from Macomb at that destination. So some are doing really well. They're graduating almost everyone. But the story here, I think, is that there's a lot of variation. Almost every UPAC school is performing above the statewide average when it comes to transfer. The average graduation rate for UPAC schools is about 15 percentage points higher than the statewide average, so that's a good thing. But there's still a lot of work to do, right? We're doing good, but there's always ways to improve it. And then when it comes to these 2 schools down here at the bottom, we think this might actually not be a low graduation rate. This could be some issue with reporting in the National Student Clearinghouse for institutions in our time frame. So another thing we need to investigate. One thing we thought of was, well, maybe at the schools where there are low graduation rates, students are experiencing a lot of transfer shock. Maybe they're just not doing very well once they get to campus. So this graph shows the graduation rates as the bar at each destination, and then the dots display their pre-transfer GPA and their post-transfer GPA. And so what we can see generally is there's not a big difference between the pre and the post-transfer GPAs at institutions with lower graduation rates. Some of them might experience transfer shock, but it looks like actually transfer shock is going on more commonly at the institutions with higher graduation rates. And that's where students are tending to have a lower GPA. So yes, one question.
Yeah, real quick. Did you look at this instead of GPA by number of credits earned?
So GPA, yeah.
Community college?
GPA by that's a good question. We did not cut the data that way, but we could look at students' GPA by credits earned. So
I meant completion by number of credits earned in community college.
Oh, I see. The credits they earned at Macomb, and then did they graduate? That's a good question too. We did not look at that, but it's something we can put on our radar. So thank you. This graph shows the credits earned at each of the UPAC destinations. And the teal line are the credits the students earned at the UPAC destination. The black line are the credits earned at Macomb. And there's one school here that's an outlier. We're not sure if that maybe they offer more technical degrees or some other kinds of degrees, or if that's like basically a reporting error in the transcript data, some kind of issue. So we need to explore that one. But generally what we can see is that UPAC students are earning between 90 to 60 credits, some down to 50 credits at the UPAC destination. And then at Macomb, students are earning about 50 credits prior to going to their destination. So we were looking, are there big differences in credit accumulation between the sending and the receiving institution? And we don't really see that here for the most part. So I'm going to keep going, and then if we can talk about it after, that would be great. The field of study across the UPAC. So here are the 22 fields of study by UPAC destination. This slide looks like a mess, but when we look closer, we can see that some UPAC schools are actually destinations for specific fields: engineering, allied health, and business and marketing. And we can also see that some UPAC schools are destinations for many fields of study. So might be harder for these schools to figure out what's going on. Next, we looked at the transfer students and bachelor's recipients by UPAC destination. And so the teal line displays the percentage of all transfers, and we can see that at 3 institutions, I should say transfer students from Macomb, about 70% of them attend the top 3 institutions. So these are the major transfer partners, and it looks like the major transfer partners are also the major people finishing bachelor's degree completers. We see that about 70% of the bachelor's degree completers, or the transfer students that go on to earn a degree, actually originate at those 2 institutions as well. So you got 2 or 3 major partners. And again, that L institution there, we think that's one of those ones with the data issues. We also looked at students' major by their field of study, whether or not they completed a bachelor's degree. And we can see here that bachelor's degree completers are spread pretty evenly across the fields, and that swirlers are actually overrepresented here in the STEM field. Okay. Next, we looked at the field of study at Macomb for students who went on and never completed a bachelor's degree. So there's some fields they're sending people and they never finish. And it looks like business and marketing has some issues for those direct transfer students, as well as arts and humanities and English. So that's where the highest share of non-completers originate at Macomb. When it comes to swirlers who never earn a degree, they're most likely to come out of the arts and the humanities and English, STEM, and the social and behavioral sciences. Great, so the takeaway from the enrollment patterns are that students with a 2-4 pattern tend to spend less time at Macomb. 2-4-2 pattern students spend the most time. Once you arrive at the destination, stopping out appears to be more common among the swirlers and the 2-4-2 transfers. So if you're a UPAC school and you get a transfer in and that student wants to take a semester off, something to consider. That might be a lever here. And then finally, a low percentage of students earn an associate prior to transferring. We also see that 71% of the transfers from Macomb attend just 3 UPAC institutions. 2 of the destinations account for 70% of the bachelor's degree completion, and that the transfer patterns and the graduation rates vary dramatically across the schools. But overall, direct transfers are the majority of students at the UPAC destinations. And then those students in business and arts and the humanities, those are most likely to come. The people who never earn a degree are most likely to come from those fields when they're at Macomb. So maybe something about those transfer pathways can be worked on. And here, now we're looking. So we've done the descriptive work, we saw what might matter, and then we want to put it into some statistical models to see, what's the relationship between those things and our outcomes. And our outcomes here, the first one we're going to look at is the type of transfer. So can we predict if you'll be a 2-4-2 transfer or a swirler relative to a direct transfer student? And then the next thing we'll look at is, can we predict if you'll actually earn a bachelor's degree? The features that we include in our model are there's a little bit about the transfer student pathway, the student characteristics, and the enrollment patterns. And just so you know, not everything I'm going to display, we didn't display everything on these slides that we put into our model. So I thought these would be kind of interesting conversation prompts, but we did include other covariates that aren't shown here today. So here, in terms of predicting the transfer patterns, for those who are technical, we ran a multinomial logit model, and basically that allows us to tell if you'll be a 2-4-2 transfer relative to a 2-4 transfer, or a swirler relative to a 2-4 transfer. So when it comes to the estimates, which are these numbers here, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the size of the number. They're reported in odd units. What we want to pay attention to is it negative or is it positive, and is it significant, because then it's different for these students. So pay attention to the direction and not really the magnitude on this one. And the whole point of this is that we think the 2-4-2 transfer and the swirler transfer may potentially be less desirable forms of transfer, and so that might give us some purchase into what characteristics are associated with those things. And what we've learned today is that that might not be the case for those 2-4 transfers, so something to keep in mind. But here we can see that holding all else constant, if we look up here, females are significant. So basically what this means is that women are less likely to swirl than to direct transfer relative to men. We also see here that other race is significant. So students that have marked another race are less likely to swirl than to direct transfer compared to white students. Year of birth is a significant predictor of 2-4-2 transfer, and so if you are younger, then you are less likely, at least in the model, controlling for all other factors, to 2-4-2 transfer. And that's different than what we saw in the descriptive slide. Next, we look at here, if you received Pell in your first term, then you are actually less likely to 2-4-2 transfer than to direct transfer, and you're more likely potentially to swirl. So it might be those Pell students that are at risk of actually swirling. And then the GPA is important too. Your first term GPA tells us for every increase in the GPA, 1 unit increase in the GPA, you are less likely to swirl. So higher GPA students, less likely to swirl. So our key takeaways again, women are less likely to swirl. Older students may be more at risk of doing the 2-4-2 pattern. Our Pell recipients are more likely to swirl and less likely to 2-4-2 transfer relative to non-Pell. And those lower GPA students are more likely to swirl than to direct transfer. Next, we'll talk about predicting student success, and the outcomes here are, did you get a bachelor's or did you get an associate degree? And we used a linear probability to model, and basically the estimates here are the percentage point increase or decrease in your probability of earning a bachelor's degree. So for students who reverse transfer, there is a 40 percentage point decrease in their probability of earning a bachelor's degree. Swirlers, if you swirl around, 30 percentage point decrease in your probability of earning a bachelor's degree. But we see that for those students, they're more likely to earn an associate degree. And this is compared to 2-4 transfer also. Women more likely to earn degrees than men. Interesting to note, students' race doesn't have any predictive ability when it comes to their bachelor's degree or associate degree attainment. Younger students are slightly more likely to earn a bachelor's degree, slightly less likely to earn the associate degree. And then we see here, if you're full-time in your first term, controlling for all other factors, we see that you're 9 percentage points more likely to earn a bachelor's and 6 percentage points more likely to earn that associate degree. Also in the model, we put in students' intent. It has no predictive ability for bachelor's degree completers, but we see students who say that their recreational intent, they are less likely to get an associate degree. Pell is associated with a decrease in the probability of getting a bachelor's. And then here we have the credits earned. So this one's practically very small, but this is controlling for all other factors, including if you're part-time or full-time. More credits you take, slightly reduces your probability of getting a bachelor's. So maybe there's a tipping point or a threshold where you can take too many credits and then you won't graduate. And then as your GPA increases, of course, your probability of getting a bachelor's also increases. We included if you got an associate pre-transfer, that doesn't seem to matter for your bachelor's degree completion. And getting a certificate appears that you're less likely to get a bachelor's degree if you get a certificate, and more likely to earn an associate degree. And so, great, thank you. So one thing to point out, these are not causal relationships. We're not trying to say, you know, a certificate causes you to not get a bachelor's degree. These are associations, so it's important to keep that in mind, that when we put other control variables in the model, these could very well change. So something to inform our thinking, but this is not like the definitive picture of what's going on here. Also, our models only explain about 18%, 17-18% of the variation in bachelor's degree completion. So that means there's a lot of other things that are really important to graduating that aren't picked up here. And so I went over the key takeaways with you all, I think, but then overall, just some main points I want to emphasize. The graduation rate of 74%, much higher than the statewide average, so that's an awesome thing. Macomb's doing well on, and the UPAC partners. And even for the swirlers, they're graduating above average. After we account for the background characteristics, students who 2-4 transfer are much likely to complete compared to students who swirl or reverse transfer. Across the UPAC, the majority of students follow that 2-4 transfer patterns, but some schools have a lot of swirlers and reverse transfers. And then all types of transfer students appear to be earning more than 60 credits at the UPAC destination. Some questions we have for you all, and I would challenge you to think about this, are, you know, how can the UPAC schools reduce the number of excess credits students accumulate? And first of all, are they accumulating excess credits, and is that a good thing or a bad thing at your institution? So do some digging around there. Then how can the UPAC schools reduce the number of 2-4-2 transfers and swirlers? And so, you know, we saw in our models that even after we account for students' academic performance and their other background characteristics, the students who swirled were still less likely to complete. So what other factors are there out there that matter? You know, are there institutional factors or other student characteristics that we might not have measured in this study? And I think we heard from the audience a few good ones that we should consider or try to get our hands on. So I appreciate that, but I'd also challenge you to go back to campus and think about it. Our next steps, we're going to share the findings with the UPAC institutions. We'll do a webinar to discuss some of these findings and go over these questions with our folks, and then we'll have a final report to share out these findings and a little bit more in-depth findings as well. So if you need more info, send me an email. You can contact Donna. We'll be happy to help you out, and I'll be around after this session if you have questions, since I know we had to move ahead to get through it. But thank you all for attending, and thanks for the opportunity to work on this project. I think it's really interesting, really exciting.